The tanks are still nerfed and Season 1 is almost upon us, and what will the meta be? Will that influence your choice? Does the damage of the tank matter? Does the fact that they take damage matters? All of it matters, and it's all predictions in the end from our internal testing and analysis and research. And let's kick it off right now with Blood Decay. And using Blood Decay, we will establish what the tiers mean in this tier list. I'm going to be putting Blood Decay all the way here into A tier. Now, A tier is where the strong tanks, the strongest tanks will go. Likely the tanks that can become the push tank. Push tanks are, you know, the tanks that people will probably do the highest of keys with. And, you know, the plus 25s, whatever will be plus 20s, I guess, because, you know, this season is pretty hard. And Blood Decay could potentially be there, but the reason I think it will not be there is because Blood Decay is likely still Blood Decay, where sure, you see it in 10s, 12s, or, you know, saw it on beta at the very least, do really well because it has a lot of self-sustain. Like, you can just survive on your own if you play properly. It's a little bit harder than it was in Dragonflight, by the way. And with the rework in its kit, it's pretty good. I don't know if you'll end up being able to pick Gorfiend's Grasp to have that AoE pull with the addition of Silence, although that's 2 talent point investment, that's pretty heavy. But if you do end up picking that and you don't suffer, you could actually see Blood Decay push even harder, since the major issues with Mythic Plus this season, one of which is the casters. And the fact that stops like grips, like stuns, like blinds, like any of that does not stop their cast from casting, right? You'll need to interrupt them. So being able to, you know, silence them with the grippy hands is going to be pretty good. But outside of that, Blood Decay is just fairly strong. It will unfortunately still hit the wall that Blood Decay usually hits, where you might just get one shot. You will get one shot before any other tank gets one shot, because the way it works, if you don't know about Blood Decay, is you have to first survive the damage and then you get to heal it. But the damage constantly goes up, so inevitably you will get one shot. At that point, your mitigation doesn't exist, whereas with every other tank, the mitigation applies before the damage hits, hence why Blood Decay is likely never going to be meta unless it becomes broken, which is what happened in the past. Now, Brewmaster has been a tank that I suspected to be fairly strong with the early stages of the beta testing and after the tank reworks, although people have been pushing more and more keys with fewer and fewer Brewmasters all around. So I don't know where it will be. It has the potential to be really good, but as it stands, I'm not too sure because the numbers are just not really there. I'm not sure how much impact the hero talents have or don't have on Brewmaster because they're not particularly amazing at this point. They'll likely keep getting tuned, and that's probably going to happen for all of the tanks, by the way. This is, of course, a prediction. This is what we kind of think might happen based on very limited data testing, because, you know, the top key pushers and players don't usually have their public logs public for whatever reason. I've just looked at the most recent dozens and dozens of logs and I couldn't find, you know, logs from top players like Dorky, for instance, and that's fine. You know, if you're going to participate in a competitive version of M+, you don't really want to give away your strats, even though most of them are also streaming. But as it stands, Brewmaster feels like it's just a little bit undertuned. The damage is good, the tankiness is good, but it feels like it's just a little bit too low for it to matter, because it can have potential to be really strong, considering that they have buffed Stagger, and it can particularly be a strong tank in the middle range of the keys, because you take a little bit less magic damage, where you assume to be playing with people who don't kick all of the casts that they need to kick, hence why you would be taking more magic damage. I don't see it at the same level of Blood Decay, even though I kind of expected it at the beginning of the beta testing to be S tier material, to be one of the strongest tanks. Doesn't feel like that's going to be the case anymore. Moving to Bear. Bear is also a fairly strong tank. I'm going to put it into A tier. I don't know which of these is stronger. Maybe Bear has the potential to be stronger than Blood Decay. It's likely that Bear will actually push higher than Blood Decay, because Bear doesn't suffer from the Blood Decay issue where you just topple over in one shot. But don't make any mistakes, your sustain has also been nerfed with Bear. And it's still anyone's guess what the hero talent will be. I mean, it's a good guess that it's going to be Loon's Guidance, Guardian, whatever, the Moon Bear, right? That's probably what you're going to end up playing. To my knowledge, Druid of the Claw is a little bit squishier than Moonbear, plus Druid of the Claw doesn't really... I mean, you have a bunch of dead talents there because you're likely never really gonna swap into cat form. Considering that we live in a world where tanks have been nerfed, being deliberately squishier just to not even do more damage, or maybe a little bit more damage, is not something that tanks usually want. Bear still has pretty good damage, really well. All tanks usually have very high damage, some of them a little bit more, some of them a little bit less, depending on how you play them. But Bear has just a really good utility kit. Bear has been historically one of the tanks that can, if played right, get armor capped in the first season of an expansion. I think that might still be the case. If I recall, I've played, when I've tested Bear, an Incarn build. It was just a mishmash. It was wasn't necessarily the best build out there. But I feel like I hit the armor cap where my damage reduction just didn't scale past about, I think it was 8 to 9 stacks of Armor with the eye level scaling at the time, by the way, because we were like squished down. So better bears will likely hit that a little bit quicker with probably also better gear. So you will essentially can reach melee physical damage, not immunity, but the most amount of damage reduction you can get from melee damage. In terms of magical damage, since your sustain and frenzy region has been nerfed or have been nerfed as a whole, you might still take quite a bit of damage, but you can play builds with Bear where you have about, I don't know, 42 seconds cooldown on Bark Skin, which can be a 40% damage reduction, a very, 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 very strong defensive. So yeah, Bear has the potential to be the push tank. I guess it probably comes down to where you want your Mark of the Wild to come, because listen, although you can probably play all the tanks with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions at any level in your keys, when it comes to S tier and what tanks are going to be pushed at the high level, that's probably down to the best players out there, and they usually want, you know, form the proper synergy, proper team. You're not going to have more than one Druid, since you want Mark of the Wild and you want a strong Druid, but you don't want multiple ones because you could get buffs other ways. And I feel like if you're going to be getting Mark of the Wild, it would either be from Resto Druid or Bear. If Resto Druid is going to be the de facto best healer in Mythic Plus in the game, you're probably not going to see Bear into S tier, and, you know, vice versa. Prot Paladin is one of those tanks you might not do well if you play it, and I am going to put Prot Paladin into... Shit. I'm gonna put it into... It's not that bad. Okay, I'll put it into C tier and I'll tell you why. Prot Paladin is the worst tank in Mythic Plus at the moment, spoiler alert for the other 2 specs, and that's not necessarily a surprise. You probably heard it before. It has been nerfed into oblivion, so much so that if you would expect it to be buffed, you would be right way more often than not, but nothing has happened so far, and I personally am a little bit worried because I will want to play a lot of Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin is going to be my first alt, Holy Paladin kind of, and it's not looking good for me. I mean, there are people who want to main Prot Paladin, you're probably going to be fine, but with a caveat. You cannot mess up your rotation. You cannot mess up your gameplay at all. You will be severely punished if you do so. If you step out of consecration for just the wrong hit that comes to your face, you might die. If you drop Shield of the Righteous just at the hit that will do a lot of damage to you, you will die. If you don't generate your holy power properly and you keep Judgment on cooldown, you will eventually die because you just won't be able to keep up with the damage that you take, and your healer will not want to play with you again, because the healer will have to heal your ass a lot. And your Words of Glory, although slightly, just very tinily buffed in the beta and the tuning, are not enough to sustain you. And considering that your defensives have also been nerfed, it's not looking that great for Protection Paladin. I honestly hope there will be some buffs. I don't think that might change much, but with a caveat, if they do, let's say, bring Prot Paladin to Bear level tankiness and damage output, although I think Prot Paladin might have more damage, it depends. You might see Prot Paladin a potential S tier spec because of Avenger's Shield. There are so many casts in this season that interrupts are likely one of the most valuable resources you could have in your group. From our testing, listen, I don't know, if you play some Sigil of Silence, AoE grips, constant stun rotations with really oiled, coordinated groups that just know when to AoE CC without hitting the DR, then yeah, it might not matter. But if you're pugging, Prot Paladin could be your best friend. The problem is that since you're so squishy and you're so underpowered, you really cannot afford to launch a lot of Avenger Shields out there, since they don't do a lot of damage, they don't generate holy power, they barely give you any tankiness, and the talents that make them do are not ideal talents to take, although you might probably still want Strength and Adversity. That, listen, Shield is just not that great to spam, right? To constantly press unless you want to interrupt. And if you do that, you will slightly get punished in your tankiness and your overall damage output, depending on how you play. So that's why Prot Paladin is a little below. But I have played Prot Paladin on the beta before some of the dungeon nerfs, and I have tanked in plus 10s, and it was okay, but it was very, very, very difficult. It's not impossible. You can do it. You do have the numbers to support you to be able to, to get all of the portals, all of the achievements in Man Plus that you want with Prot Paladin. But you have to be really, really good at it, because it's not looking like it's going to work out any other way. Prot Warrior is a big contender this season. I'm going to be putting it into A tier, probably in, I don't know where this is going to be. So here's a caveat. It's very close to Bear. Prot Warrior does a lot of damage with the Colossus hero talent, but you are squishier than with the Mountain Thane hero talent, which is probably what you want to be playing anyway, and you will have a little bit less damage. And the damage essentially that you have with Mountain Thane is significantly lower than other tanks, and the damage is kind of important because Prot Warrior doesn't really bring anything really valuable to the team. Sure, you have your AoE stuns and all that, but so does everybody else. Rallying Cry has been just gutted since Shadowlands. Shadowlands was, I think if I recall, about 35% HP boost, and it was good. It was never amazing, but it was good. And now a 15% extra HP to everybody. That's not a group utility that you can be proud of. Battle Shout is debatable, and I'll leave that for last because that matters where Prot Warrior will end up being in. There are some unique things that Prot Warrior can do that make it really tanky, maybe one of the tankiest tanks in the game, which that should be the case since, once again, Prot Warrior rather doesn't bring anything. So it might as well have the most amount of damage and be the tankiest of the tanks to, separate yourself from the others, because it has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, self-sustain in the game as well. So the things that Prot Warrior can do that are particularly unique are Spell Reflects, which are really, really great when they can happen. And those are very niche situations. They're very good. Usually that's when Prot Warrior survives, where other tanks really, really struggle. Spell Block is really strong, can give you, I think it's about 30 seconds of block for spells. That will make you incredibly tanky. You have a really good utility kit defensive kit rather, when it comes to your cooldowns. One other thing that you could do with Prot Warrior that will make it really good is play Disrupting Shout, which, is your challenging shout AoE taunt turned into an AoE taunt and interrupt on a 1.5 minute cooldown, which is the same cooldown that Sigil of Silence is. However, in order for this to actually silence the target has, or the targets in AoE, would have to be already casting for that to happen. So it's not as great as mandatory on-demand silence. However, if you can actually pull this off, it can probably be really, really, really good. You don't have to sacrifice a little bit of rage generation and a little bit of damage and maybe a little bit of tankiness to get Disrupting Shout, because the talent setup for Prot Warrior is just atrocious. You hardly have any build flexibility whatsoever. But if you do end up making it work, it can be what sets you apart from most other tanks. Battle Shout, since I mentioned that we would be coming back to it, it depends exactly on what the meta is. Now, this is a very hot take, and almost nobody agrees with this hot take, but I want to die on this hill, okay? I predict that the meta will, by the end of the season, will be heavily favoring melee DPS. The reason I say that is because there are just way too many casts in the game. I know that melee mechanics are particularly atrocious. However, there are way too many casts in the dungeon pool that range DPS just don't reliably have enough stops to do it. Considering that, we need interrupts more than ever, since casts are on a chain sequence, are recastable after you stop them. So if a target casts a spell that you want to interrupt, like Mass Tremors in Grim Batol, and you stun that target after it comes out of the stun will do Mass Tremors again. If you grip that target, it will recast Mass Tremors. If you knock it back, if you fear it, if you do anything to it, it will recast that until it gets interrupted. So only interrupts work. Now, we know that casters have longer cooldown interrupts, so that would probably favor melee meta to be a little bit better. Now, that has a lot of caveats. For instance, you could have an elemental shaman that has the shortest kick in the game and is a caster. You could have maybe balanced druid, silence a target a lot, but that silence is very unreliable and it's on a big cooldown, so that's also super niche. But unless you make a specific composition in your team that would have just the right amount of interrupts that you need, it's Likely that we're going to see more melee than ranged, considering that there are a lot of mechanics that really punish ranged quite a bit in Mythic Plus, even though range is usually safer at a distance. The heavy hitters and the mechanics that usually are one-shots or close to one-shots or dangerous are usually melee mechanics. With that being said, if it becomes a melee meta, Prot Warrior could potentially be the S tier tank because Battle Shout works way better on melee, even though, let's say, Vengeance, who is next on the list, is still buffing melees, and we'll get to that in a second. But until then, Prot Warrior will remain A tier. In order for Prot Warrior to be S tier tank, in my opinion, in a prediction tier list, it would have to have the most amount of damage out of all the tanks, because that would be a big plus, not the deciding factor, but a big plus, and to be the tankiest, which I think it might already be the tankiest out of all the tanks. Debatable. Vengeance will actually go into A tier, and we'll talk about the Vengeance a little bit. Chaos Brand is, after Arcane Intellect nerfs, might be one of the strongest buffs you can have in a Mythic Plus group, considering that it buffs all of your casters, especially if the meta is caster heavy, which everyone is speculating to be. You'll probably want an Augmentation Evoker, you'll probably want a mage of a particular spec, it doesn't really matter. And we'll see what the other specs are. Could be a Warlock, could be an Elemental Shaman, could be a melee actually. And even if it is a melee, unless it's a Warrior or Outlaw Rogue, maybe Windwalker too, which I doubt Windwalker is going to be top of the meta. All of the other melees do magical damage in some sense, hence why Chaos Brand will also work and buff them as well, whilst Battle Shout will only buff the tank and the melees that just do physical damage. On top of that, Chaos Brand also buffs healer's damage, unless that healer is just purely just a Resto Druid cat weaving, which is hardly the case because you're still going to be moonfiring and sunfiring. You will still want Chaos Brand as a buff. Now, Vengeance is tanky, way tankier than you might think, way tankier than I thought, turns out, and it still has quite a lot of damage, even though the damage has been nerfed, and it's likely going to be addressed even further. It has been nerfed all across the board since Dragonflight, so if you are scared that we're going to have another Vengeance meta, it's not going to be as oppressive as we had in Dragonflight, since Illuminated Sigils has been nerfed. Now Sigil of Silence is on a 1.5 minute cooldown, similar to Disrupting Shout for Warrior, but it's more reliable, as I've said before, since you don't need to have the mobs cast at the second of the silence effect. And this is why I believe that Vengeance will likely be the S tier spec going into the new season. It's looking like the most likely to be that spec, unless some tuning happens. Unless some tuning happens to Warrior and maybe Bear, which are the ones that are the most likely able to dethrone Vengeance. But I do want to mention this, that if this tier list would be a Season 3 Dragonflight tier list, all of the tanks except Vengeance would go one tier down. The A tier would be empty, just to showcase how strong Vengeance was. So, because I know there are a lot of people that think, oh, Vengeance again. Woo! The same thing as before. It's not the same. The tanks are actually relatively very close. And it might actually matter what tank you pick, because it can synergize with different compositions of players. So if you have a party that doesn't work well with Vengeance, you can actually bring another tank and probably have better success than with the Vengeance. Maybe if that tank is like a Warrior or a Bear, maybe even a DK. This is the predictions, by the way, for the tanks. Not final, by the way, the disclaimer, and it could very well change since we're still getting buffs and nerfs as we speak to all of the specs. And the dungeons have just been nerfed like last week if you've kept up with the patch notes, so it's not final. However, you can also watch our melee predictions for Mythic Plus to see how that ages, because that was done before some of the recent tuning for melees, which I don't think it changes much, but until the season starts, that might very well change. So just have fun, okay? Just click it here.